respecting the autonomy of religion and the autonomy of politics, but at the same time to believe that there are linkages and that the separation isn't absolute. And so in the paper I have a little kind of table which has a kind of ironic point, because it argues that radical secularists and radical whatever the opposite is, just for the sake of the paper I call them radical religionists, though it's not an adequate term really, have more in common with each other because they assume that separation is interpreted absolutely. And one asserts it and the other denies it. Whereas there can be loads of people in the middle, people I call moderate secularists, moderate religionists and so on, who actually have more in common with each other than they do with their, as it were, radical peers. And so in a way I would say, if someone said, well, what's the politics behind what you're doing and so on, I mean, I could describe it in all kinds of ways, and certainly I'd want to refer to some notion of multicultural equality. But another way of describing the politics behind the paper is that it aims to create and legitimize a broad middle. It tries to push the radicals out of dominating the conceptual and discursive space in the middle and allow the people who don't hold the absolute positions to be in closer dialogue, communion, coalition with each other. That's the first section of the paper. The second section of the paper is about then, the character of secularism, and to remind myself what I say, I better look at it. So, having established at an abstract level that mutual autonomy does not require separation, I then take it further and begin making the point that the separation of religion and state politics is a possible interpretation of secularism, and that indeed it does not make sense in terms of historical actuality and contemporary adjustments to see anything other than linkages as well as separation. Most of Western, especially northwestern Europe, where France is the exception, not the rule, is best understood in more evolutionary and moderate terms than an ideological characterization of Western secularism. They have several important features to do with more pragmatic politics, with a sense of history, tradition and identity, and most importantly, there's an accommodative character which is an essential feature of some historical and contemporary secularisms in practice. It is true that some political theorists and radical secularists have a strong tendency to abstract that out when talking about models and principles of secularism. But that's partly, as it were, the occupational hazard of abstract reasoning, that you take out some of the contingent characteristics of what actually makes institutions work in practice and try and state their essentials in ways which actually distorts historical reality and contemporary reality. Accommodative or moderate secularism, I think, is a genuine form of secularism. And you might say, well, does that even need to be said? But actually, if you look at some political theory, it does need to be said. A lot of political theory, contemporary political theory, is dominated by the idea that there are basically two models of secularism. There is a liberal model of secularism in which the prime issue is freedom of religion, and that's embodied in the US Constitution, and there is a republican model of secularism which is exemplified by France and which emphasizes freedom from religion. And that everything else, including our own poor country, is somehow an inferior version of one or the other model of secularism, either because we don't properly understand them and therefore have gone awry in our practice, or because we just lack good politics. And I want to argue exactly the opposite. I want to argue that what we have in this country and countries like Denmark and Sweden and Germany and so on are genuine forms of secularism. They're not inferior versions of someone else's secularism. They are appropriate to our own countries and our own polities, reflecting our own histories and our own sociological dynamics, including the contemporary dynamics of adjusting to newly settled groups, including religious groups. And what I would say is one of the essential features of the kind of secularism that is our secularism, accommodative or moderate secularism, is that it's developed a historical practice in which explicitly or implicitly organized religion is treated as a public good, not just as a private good. This can take not only the form of an input into a legislative forum, such as the House of Lords. Anyway, I want to argue that there can be a number of institutional features. I mean, denominational schools supported by public money within a state-regulated system. That could be another example where religion is seen as a public good and not just as a private good. And taking that argument further, you might say a lot further, without all the justification that I want to be able to provide, is that I would argue that it's quite possible in a country like Britain to treat the claims of all religions in accordance with multicultural equality without having to abolish the established status of the Church of England. You couldn't have it exactly as it is. This isn't an argument for the status quo. All I'm saying is you don't have to disestablish the Church of England in order to achieve multicultural equality. Given that the Church of England has come to be a very weak form of establishment, and that the Church has come to play a positive ecumenical and multi-faith role. Faced with an emergent multi-faith situation, or where there's a political will to incorporate previously marginalized faiths and sects, and to challenge the privileged status of some religions, the context-sensitive and conservationist response may be to pluralize the state-religion link rather than to sever it. This indeed is what is happening across many countries in Western Europe, not just in Britain. In relation to our own case, one can see it in a lot of incremental, ad hoc and experimental steps. I would say it's happening in a relatively ad hoc way. I don't think anyone's got a kind of policy trajectory worked out, and we can see, certainly up to now it's been pretty ad hoc. For example, some years ago, I think a lot of people remember, Prince Charles said that the heir to the office of Supreme Governor of the Church of England, he let it be known that he would, as a monarch, prefer the title Defender of Faith to the historic title Defender of the Faith. And there are lots of other examples one could think of in ways in which government has shifted, or the ways in which organized religious groups themselves relate to each other, to ways in which the Church of England, for instance, chooses to speak in a more interfaith way, to promote the concerns and interests and grievances, grievances based on inequalities and injustices of other faiths and so on. And I have a couple of examples here to do with reform of the House of Lords and so on, but I don't have time to go into them now if they arise in the discussion. That's fine. What I do say about them is that such proposals might be regarded as a form of reforming or pluralizing establishment